Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and this is What's Happening. Thank you so much for joining us and for being on this program. We're going to talk about voting and voter suppression and all things related to that. And what's happening is our weekly event that we have online that we talk about just a variety of subjects with leaders from across the state. So I'm glad that you have tuned in with us. It's an important topic today, as it was last week when we talked about voting. If you have comments or questions that you want to give to our leaders that we're speaking with today, just put those in the comment section, and we will try to get those to the end. I'm going to have both of our speakers, if you'll mute yourselves for now, because I'm hearing an echo in the background. So Al and Rob, if you'll mute yourselves for now. Oh, that's great. Perfect. And then we'll just have you unmute yourselves as you talk. But anyway, I have with me two tremendous friends who have been doing a lot of work around voting across our state. And we know that our nation and even our state has a long list of things that it has done over the years to suppress the vote for particular groups of people, particularly people of color, communities of color, and other people who are marginalized, people who are eligible to vote and should be able to vote. And there's also kind of this narrative that goes around about security of the vote versus the right to vote. And so we're going to talk about all of those things. And I am delighted to have Pastor Rob Johnson with us, and he is part of a number of different organizations, including No Justice, No Peace, 2020 Vision Project, and the Urban Impact Show. And then I also have with us Al Womble, who is also part of No Justice, No Peace and the 2020 Vision Project. Welcome, Rob and Al. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to start with Rob. If you will tell us just a little bit about yourself. We know the names of your organizations, but tell us a little bit about yourself, family, work, all of those pieces, whatever you want to share.
First of all, Connie, thank you, and a huge shout out to Interfaith Alliance of Iowa for the work that you all are doing, and for our community, our community for showing up. Shout out to my big brother, Mr. Al Womble, for definitely being on this with us. Honestly, I'm excited to be here just because I love talking about the opportunity around voting, because I firmly believe that when you wake up in the morning and you breathe air, you're breathing in a policy, because somebody that you voted for allows for an environmental policy to exist. And so for people who say voting doesn't concern them or doesn't affect their everyday life, when you wake up in the morning and you take that breath in, you've just breathed in a policy. And so I just want people to really see why it's important, and then also just see why people take advantage of it to get people not to vote. And so that's a little bit about me, is I'm very passionate about voting, and I want to make sure that we're getting the right message out there.
Thank you, Rob. And Al, what do you want to share with folks about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me on, Connie. I really do appreciate it. If you guys can hear me, can you give me a thumbs up? I know my connection was spotty earlier.
You're good.
Okay. So, I echo what Rob says. A lot of things that we are looking at right now when we're talking about the problem that we're facing with individuals who are becoming homeless. When we look at the issues that are affecting our schools and what they can and cannot teach and what individuals can and cannot say. When we look at, the situations that's happening with access to healthcare, all of that has to do with voting. And, it's important that we get out there and we help people understand that, when they vote, it's really about what's happening in their streets. It's about what's happening in their homes, what's happening in their neighborhoods. And we have to make sure that we get people out to vote, not by the same traditional methods that we always did, but by making sure we're actually getting out in these neighborhoods, in these areas and talking to people directly, and make sure that we're targeting some of these areas that typically haven't received a lot of political outreach. Because when Rob and I have shown up to certain places, that's the first time they've ever seen anyone. And that should tell you a lot about, the way voter outreach has typically been done.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. I think that's important for those of us who have voted all of our adult lives to understand that not everyone has the same experience. And so I want to take you back, and I'm going to start with Al on this, and take you back to your childhood, to your teen years. And what do you remember? And for some of us, it's a longer period of time than others on this screen. But what do you remember from your childhood or from your teen years I see Rob laughing, of the adults in your life and their voting? Did they vote? Whoever those significant adults were in your life, in your household, in your family, did they vote? Did they have access to voting? And did they talk about voting? And Al, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Connie. I know for Rob, this might be stretching back quite a few decades. I see him giggling there. But I grew up in a single parent household. It was just, me and my mom and my sister. And my mom definitely voted. She was very active. In fact, and there's a truck.
You're good.
We, in fact, my grandmother was the president of the school board in her area in Clinton, Iowa. So being politically involved had always been, something that was a tradition in my family. Not only that, my mother and I would watch the 6 o'clock evening news together. Would watch the national news, and then we'd watch the local news. And then we would have discussions about what we saw. We'd have discussions about what was happening. So it wasn't just a matter of, as a kid, I watched the news, then I would talk about it with my mom. And then since I was a curious kid, often when I went to school, I would look these things up. I would look up different issues. I would look up different situations that were happening in our world. So politics for me was something that was always part of my household. And something that just, was something that was always interesting to me. I always tell people that the first time I really got interested in politics and really started reading and looking into it and reading the paper was after the assassination of Anwar Sadat in Egypt. And that, for some of your listeners, is a very long time ago, before the good Reverend Rob Johnson was born. And so that fascination has always been there for me. And then just some of the people in my family have always, spurred me towards that interest.
Thanks, Al. Thanks for sharing that. And Rob Johnson, how about you? What was the voting pattern like in your family, and did people vote, and did they talk about that?
Yeah, my mom was a heavy hitter. She played no games when it came to voting, when it came to being involved in our community. And she believed in being involved in our community all the way. So she believed in family conversations and being involved in the African American community, having internal discussions with things that we needed to work on. But she also believed in making sure that we showed up. She voted in city council, or in Chicago, it was alderman. She voted in alderman elections. She made sure she voted in every mayoral election, state representatives, state senators, U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, presidential. She made sure that she was highly involved in every single one of those. She actually helped volunteer with Reverend Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and some of those guys from the Rainbow Push Coalition out there in Chicago. And so for me, she would drag me along with her, but also I was a mama's boy. And so it wasn't necessarily dragging. It was more so me hanging on to her leg and attached to her hip at all times. But yeah, she was a powerhouse. She didn't play when it came to making sure that she showed up for the community. And that's what I believe she has really passed down to my sisters and I.
That is awesome. The three of us have all of that in common. always was involved in conversations, but also went to the polls with my one parent or the other when they were voting, and I replicated that with my kids as well, and took them to the poll, and they love to go because they love to put the ballot in the machine and have it like be whisked away. And so, I think it's important for us to model that. As in your family household, was there conversation, as two Black men, was there conversation about the history of voting and ways that our nation and various states made it difficult for the Black community to vote over the years, and when voting rights came into being, and all of those pieces? Was that a conversation that happened in your home or in your circle of influence?
I'll kick off and then I'll throw it to you, Al. I'll kick off simply by saying yes. It was taught to me from the very beginning on the importance of the history of voting, especially when it came to things like what happened in 1968 during the Democratic Convention that happened in Chicago, when that big movement of African Americans who wanted that right to vote, and there was a complete onslaught of people on them, dogs sicked on them, water holes turned on them. That whole thing with Mayor Daley that took place in Chicago in 1968 with the Democratic Convention, and we also got to remember those were Democrats. Mm-hmm. Right? Those weren't Republicans. Those were Democrats who had made this thing happen with all of these Black folks. And so the history of it has always been there. And my mother, running with the great Dr. Jesse Jackson, that history has always been a part of the push and the motivation on why we do what we do, because we don't want to let those people who have fought, who have bled, who have died, we don't want to let them down.
Thanks, Rob. And Al?
Yeah, so my mom was active during the 60s and had been involved in some different protests and marches. And at one point was actually hit with a bat for involvement in civil rights protests. So it was definitely something that I was made aware of as well. We talked about, the difficulties that individuals have as far as accessing the vote, people who wanted to stop them, what their motivations were and why. And, that the struggle needed to continue because we still see individuals, as soon as the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, there were people who were trying to strip and gut that particular piece of legislation almost immediately, and then also trying to come up with other different ways by which they could affect the vote, by making sure it was difficult for people to either vote or access the polls. There's a great book called Democracy in Chains that people should read to understand all of the things that were done to prevent people from voting. So that was something that, we definitely talked about and discussed, and, was, like Rob, part of my growing up is understanding these struggles and, why they were being made.
Thank you to both of you for sharing that and for sharing a bit of your own family history with that. I want to fast forward then to today, and you all, as Al alluded to a little bit ago, you've done a tremendous amount of work over the last several years of engaging people and communities, particularly communities of color, in registering to vote and in actually taking the action of voting. And so I'm interested in the stories that you hear when you engage people. You're tabling in a community and talking with folks. The stories that people tell you of why they have not registered to vote or why they don't vote, whether it is, life just gets in the way and lots of reasons around that, or if there are stories that they tell you of things that the system does that really infringes on their ability to vote, to take that action. And wondering if there's some stories, just a couple maybe of what you're hearing from folks. And I'm going to start with Al on that.
Well, it's definitely the system. I've heard people complain again and again that it is, difficult. It is difficult for them to vote, and they are making it more difficult. And I think I'm going to allude to something else that I heard over and over again. There isn't necessarily one story. There's so many that Rob and I heard as we traveled across the state. But it's that lack of political outreach to certain areas and certain communities that both parties are guilty of, that where these people are like, I don't know these candidates, I don't know what the issues are, without actually getting out to these communities and discussing the issues that are important to them. The idea of voting at times is, well, why bother? Nothing ever changes. They need to see that there are parties that are actually out there fighting for what is important to them. And people need to get out there in between elections as well. People have often said they'll show up when there's an election, but then after that, we never see you again. So it's got to be that there's got to be that outreach to the community, and that, people understand that their vote does count. Their vote really does matter. But if you're not out there talking to them about it, then that's one of the roadblocks to voting. If I'm not going to appeal to you for it, if I'm not going to talk to you about it and why it's important and what are the issues at stake, or more importantly, learn from the people what those issues are that is important to them, then, that's what creates those barriers to voting. So yes, it is definitely the system, but it's also that lack of outreach that I heard over and over again.
I completely concur with that, Connie, because the system itself, yesterday on the Urban Impact Show, we were talking about how the system itself is not built in a way to help people advance. It's built in a way to keep people right where they are. Like, the voting can help us lead to economic development. Economic development can help us lead to better education. Better education can help us lead to more businesses. More businesses can help us lead to more money. More money can help us lead to more advancements. More advancements can then help us lead to continue that cycle again, back to better education, back to more businesses. And so that cyclical cycle that we continue to see can happen from voting is obviously deterred by what happens that comes out of policy. And I don't mean to get political, but I do. What came out of the Iowa House and the Senate this year was extremely harmful for people who will look at this system and say, this is the problem. When you put a law into place that allows for people to cut the voting hours back, to cut the time period for early voting, to not allow volunteers to go and help or collect ballots that are not family members, you are actually deterring people and putting more roadblocks in the way. If I'm an elderly man or woman sitting at a home trying to decide on how to vote, but I don't have transportation, I don't have the necessary resources to get around or to do what I want to do, I am dependent on somebody else. That somebody else happens to be my overworked son or daughter who's working more than one job to provide for the family, who's also trying to make sure that children have what they need, that homework is done, that food is on the table, that the lights are on. When we're in moments like this, it's when voting is key. We have failed. We have failed at making sure that voting takes care of those individuals who really need for it to take care of them. Those people who are really struggling, who are really in a moment of need, don't get the help because they can never make it to the polls because we keep trying to make voting more hard. We keep trying to make voting difficult for them. And I struggle with this, Connie. I struggle because Al told you, we went to neighborhoods that never saw people come in there and talk about voting. So imagine what has happened to those communities. They've become dilapidated because there is no one there fighting for the resources to go into that neighborhood for it to be revitalized, for it to be up, for the upkeep of it. And what happens? Politicians forget about it. People write them off in policy because here's the thing. We put the measure on the ballot that if you wanted a swimming pool in your neighborhood to come and vote for it, you didn't vote for it. So we didn't do it. And because you didn't vote for that one thing, we've decided to let the rest of it go. This is where we find ourselves. I'm sorry, Connie.
You are good. You say it as it is, and that's what we need to hear. And you're exactly right that voting is about power, and be able to use your voice in order to engage that power. And we know that those who make decisions at whether it's at the local level, school board, city, county level, or whether it's at the state level, or whether it's at the federal level, they are making decisions that impact communities all over the state at that very level, that very local level. And I rarely do this, but I'm going to say something. So a lot of folks know that I ran for office, public office, a few years ago and didn't win, which was fine. But when I was door knocking, I door knocked in a neighborhood one time, and a man came to the door, and I introduced myself, and he said to me, "You're running for public office?" And I said, "I am." And he said, "I have never had somebody running for office knock on my door." And he had lived there for decades. And he was a Black man and lived in a very poor neighborhood. And the district that I live in is the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. It is one of the most diverse districts. And I don't say that to talk about myself. I say that to say exactly what you were saying, Al, that it is both the system and it is how the parties do outreach and how the individual elected officials do our outreach and leaving some neighborhoods behind. So that is a very real thing, and people are impacted by that because of how we pay attention to those neighborhoods and the policies that matter to them. So, Rob, you talked about a little bit about what happened in the legislature this last year, and there's part of that policy. There were a couple of bills that passed in the state legislature, voted on favorably by the Republicans that hold control in the legislature, restrictions to the amount of time to vote, the restrictions in a whole lot of restrictions on absentee voting, not only the process of it, but also in terms of, as you said, limiting who can pick up ballots and all of those different pieces. And also the third piece, really big piece of it, was deactivating people off of the rolls if you don't vote for one time in a general election. You can certainly get yourself back on the rolls. It's not a permanent thing, but you have to be active in doing that. So talk a little bit, and you've done this a little bit, Rob, but Al, if you would talk a little bit more about the changes that were made and the impact on marginalized communities, specifically by those changes. And marginalized communities can be communities of color, it can be people who are disabled, it can be people in poverty, it can be, there's the elderly. So what do you foresee the impact of those changes in public policy on marginalized communities? Al?
Well, it's definitely going to make it harder for them to vote. And so what that forces individuals like Rob and I do, who care about these communities and want them to have their voice heard, that means we need to work harder. We need to recruit more volunteers. We need more people to reach out to both Rob and myself to assist with this effort. And we need to get people moving sooner and faster. You know, when they reduce the number of days that individuals have to vote, they reduce the time, they remove the satellite voting locations. You know, somebody said that, oh, well, people still have 20 days to turn in their vote. And, you know, I always bring up this fact. You need to think about the single mom who's working 2 jobs, the guy who works in construction, who works 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, or the person who right now is unemployed and is doing everything they can just to make it by. voting isn't always necessarily at the top of their mind. And the easier that you can make it for them to be able to participate in the voting process, the more likely they will be to vote. And so these particular laws that were passed by the legislature are really harmful for people who don't work a specific Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 job and have all the free time in the world to be able to take off and vote. I found it interesting last year, during the presidential election. There are many times I went downtown and there are some people who saw my Facebook Live videos where you saw lines stretching around the block for people to go vote. And I was there at 2:00 in the afternoon. Some people do not work jobs that allow them to leave at 2:00 in the afternoon because they work in service industries or hourly based jobs, where if they leave that job, that means they're losing money to be able to go vote. And when it comes once again to being able to vote by mail, that's a process where we have to start early, because we know that some of these individuals haven't had experience with it. And we also know that there has been, as I've said before, no outreach in these areas to educate people on how to register and how to vote by mail.
Right. Rob, what would you add to that?
I'm sorry, Connie, I got to throw this in there.
Yep.
Al touched on a very big point. Imagine that mom who's standing at work. She gets a phone call from her son. Let's just say his name is Noah. So mom, Sherry, is at work and her son Noah calls. Noah says, "Mom, I don't feel well. I need to go to the doctor." So Sherry is standing there at work, looking at her paycheck in her mind, the time in which she has, but also counting the hours in which she needs in order to pay the bills.
Right.
So not only have we made it more difficult for her to show up and vote, but we've also made it difficult by not showing up and voting, because now she's trying to decide, do I go take Noah to the doctor and lose out on this hourly wage that I'm already struggling to keep? Or do I stay here and risk Noah's health by making a decision because we need our light bill paid? So imagine Sherry's moment, the amount of mental anguish that Sherry just went through, just simply trying to decide whether or not to take Noah to the hospital. And imagine that same moment happening between that and voting. If she's struggling that much to take Noah to the hospital, what decision do we think she's going to make between that, staying at work, or getting to the polls in time?
Yeah. It's a very real scenario for a lot of people. And sometimes we don't think of it in those very real case scenarios, real case moments in life. This fall, in November, Iowa has local elections happening in November. And I'm wondering, for your work with the 2020 Project and No Justice, No Peace, how will you two and your team, those who are involved with your work, how will you be addressing some of these changes that have happened? This is real public policy now. We have to live with it for the moment in time anyway. How will you be addressing some of these changes in the work that you are doing across the state?
Al, you go first. Go ahead.
So, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Okay. So first, Rob and I have put together a tour that we plan to go around the state. We've already had a successful stop in Davenport. We've got other stops. But to create these sort of issue-based town halls where we plan to discuss the issues that are actually affecting these folks. Like Rob said, getting, adequate health care, getting access to, education, access to voting, having discussions just about these issues to get people fired up and interested in the process, and letting them know if you're not happy with what's going on, then you need to make sure that you vote for a change. You need to make sure, because really your school board, your city council, and your mayor is going to have a much more direct of an impact on your personal life than will the presidency of the United States. We have traditionally low voter turnout for, these local elections. It's true. In some cases, like even with the mayor of Des Moines, it was just over 10% of the population of Des Moines who voted for mayor, which is insane when you consider the amount of money that was spent on that election. But so what we need to do is connect the issues that are happening in these people's direct lives to the voting process, and then get them registered to vote. You can't just go in there talking about party or candidate, because these people in many cases don't care about party and they don't know these candidates. But you got to say, listen, this is what's going on in your life. Do you care about this and do you care about that? If you want to see a change, then you need to vote for that change. Or if you're like the way that you're being represented, vote for that. And then it's a matter of making sure that we also talk to some of these candidates and say, what, once again, I know I keep bringing this up. Here's a whole community out here that has not been spoken to yet. You need to get out there. And not only do you need to let these folks know who you are, but you need to listen to who they are. You need to listen to their concerns.
Yep. Rob, what would you add to that?
So I want to address something really quick. When Al and I said last time we were going on the road to do this, we had people say to us, why are you focusing a lot on African American communities when you all should be going to every community to talk about voting? But I didn't hear the same reaction when other groups went to certain ethnic or racial groups to go do voting outreach. I did not hear the same feedback to those groups of, well, why are you only focused on this in particular section or this in particular set of people when you should be doing everything? But I realized that happens to Black organizations a lot of times when they are focused on trying to make sure that African American people are showing up to the polls and that they have what is needed. But it doesn't happen to other groups. And I'm always like, man, this is like, it's okay. I want people to understand that it is okay for us to go to African American communities and help get African American people registered to vote. We have partnered with other groups to do other things, but it's okay. Like I never understood why there was always this major pushback on when we decide to do something for the African American community. And I even hear pushback, and I hate to even go here, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Just even if you decided, Connie, you know what, we're gonna focus solely on the African American community for one thing, people are going to come to you and say, well, wait a minute. Well, what about this? Or what about that? Or what about this? Right? But if you say you was going to focus on another group or another section, you won't get that same pushback.
Right.
It's only when we focus on Black issues. And I was trying to tell folks that if we help save and put in and implement good policies around Black agendas, you raise all tides.
Yep.
Because a good policy for Black folk is a good policy for other folk too. Making sure that people are paid enough to live, making sure people are able to afford health care, making sure that folks are able to take care of families and that daycare isn't as expensive as a house and a car. Like these are all policies that are good for all. It's not just obviously we're focused on this section because this section, statistically speaking, is being hurt the worst, has the most problems when it comes to policy, have been discriminated the most when it came to voting. So I just wanted to put that out there. I wanted to put that out there because kind of, I don't bite my tongue and I say what I need to say because I noticed, Al brought up the tour, and I want people to understand, yes, we're going to hit neighborhoods, but we are going to focus on getting these Black neighborhoods that we have seen with low voter turnout, because we want to make sure that their voices are being heard, that they are showing up to the polls. And if there's anything that we can do to make sure that that happens, if we have any control over being out there and doing that, I'm going to make sure that we do it. And shout out to all of these other organizations who are doing the exact same thing to make sure that people's voices are being heard.
First of all, you say whatever you need to say because you always speak the truth. So that you are welcome to say it however you want, whenever you want, every single time. Secondly, we obviously lost Al somewhere in there. Hopefully he will join us back in. I know he was having some connection issues earlier, so hopefully he will join back in on the conversation. But if not, I am quite sure that Rob Johnson can carry the day because he always does anyway. So I want to, and thank you for saying what you just said. And organizations have different missions. Organizations have different focus on different works in different communities and audiences and targets. So if anybody's giving pushback to No Justice, No Peace or 2020 Project, that's on them. And so I want to go to this idea. I introduced kind of the idea of it early in the show, but there's often this tension between an argument about whether or not, kind of a hierarchy of needs of whether or not we need to protect the system, protect the integrity of the system. We heard this in debate over the voting bills this year. We heard it time and time and time again. Or whether or not protecting people's individual rights to vote, was more important. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on how you balance that. Yes, of course, we have to have integrity of the system. That's a given, whatever that is. But how do we balance that integrity of the system to make sure that every person is given full opportunity to exercise their constitutional right to vote? How do we balance that fairly and equitably and assurance to each voter?
Yeah, I would loved for Al to have been here for this part, because I know he would have added something in here that I just wouldn't even think of. And so I'm excited for him to come back and join us. I will say this: when it comes to let me start here. Connie, have you been to a hotel where you can check in on your phone?
Not a hotel, but airline.
Okay. So nowadays, I'm a member of a couple of hotel chains because of how much we travel.
Sure.
And so one of those hotel chains, you could check in on your phone. Not only can you check in on your phone, but you can even bypass stopping at the front desk to get keys, because they can then give your cell phone access to unlock the door through your cell phone.
Okay.
It picks up the key code from your phone, and you're able to unlock the door and go into your room. You don't even have to stop at the front desk to get keys. I brought that up because we're simply telling people that the antiquated system of how we like to vote is the only way to vote. If I can check in my hotel room with my phone, if I can unlock the hotel room door with my phone, and there is security put in place to make sure that nobody else can get into my room, How in the world does the government, who writes the policies to allow this type of technology to even exist, how is it that the government can't do the same thing around voting? That we can't create a system that has a security process that will protect the integrity of the vote, but yet make voting a little bit easier. Connie, I struggle when we say stuff like, oh, there's no funding. Oh, we can't find it. But then all of a sudden, here's $1 billion for infrastructure. But yet we had no money to extend the eviction moratorium to make sure that folks yesterday wasn't put out of their homes. Right. We had no money. But somehow we come up with the money for other stuff. And so my thing is this: we need to make an investment into our election system to bring it up to date. Long gone are the days where people are coming in, filling out the bubble like a multiple choice question on the ACT, and then putting it into the thing. Right? Long gone are those days. We need to create an opportunity for voting to be easier, and we have the technology to protect it. We just won't use it. Because I'll be honest with you, Connie, correct me if I'm wrong, but in order for them to have the availability for the phone to unlock the door, some security measure had to be put in place. Am I right?
Yes.
Because you can't get into room 406.
Right.
But I can. And my whole point to that is not only do we have the technology to do it, but we also have the people to do it. Because this technology didn't create itself.
Right. Well, and we know that technology has just exploded over the years, and particularly, I would say, the last 10, 15 years. And so I do think that it is the having the determination that we're going to make sure that folks have the ability to do this and to do it safely, but also that all people have access in a variety of different ways.
Yes.
Yeah, and not everybody has access to technology, so you still have to have some of those low tech pieces, right?
You do for maybe some of the less fortunate, but imagine if we put a voting kiosk at the corner. Let's just use Des Moines for example, right? Let's imagine we put a voting kiosk outside at the corner of the John R. Grubb YMCA block over there on 13th and College.
Yeah.
Imagine if we put a voting kiosk outside of the McDonald's over there on 6th Avenue, right across from Mercy Hospital or Quick Trip.
Yep.
Right? People without access to certain things, they still got to go to Quick Trip to get gas or a snack or something. They're gonna go somewhere. They're gonna do something. And we are simply making voting difficult for them. And why is unbeknownst to me, besides the simple fact, is that we really don't want people doing it. And then we use as an excuse election fraud, voting security, and all of that. And I want to be clear on this. I'm all for making sure that we protect not only the sanctity of our vote, protect the act of voting, and protect our elections. We can still do that by making sure that everybody who is 18 or older has the opportunity to vote. And here's what we could do, Connie. We could even say, as much money as we put in advertising the COVID vaccine, we could put into advertising voting, right? We could say, hey, look, just make sure. And then we can even, if let's say we created an app for those who are technologically advanced, we created an app for voting. The federal government and the state government already has all of your information. So you putting in your information for the federal government or the state government, they already have it. Why do you think we have birth certificates, social security cards?
Right.
your address is even a pinpoint for the government. Like, so what we're doing, like, we're every excuse that's there on oh man, we gotta protect, election fraud. We don't want dead people voting. Okay, neither do I. But at the same time, we're trying to make voting harder and not easier, and that kind of is problematic.
Well, and I think those arguments are really a distraction to take us away from the real point of the intention of keeping some groups of people from voting.
Racism.
So, yeah.
It's simple
Simple
word.
Absolutely.
Racism is not the act of you just not liking me because I'm black. Racism is the act of you enacting policy that purposely holds me back, that purposely is designed for me to not be able to get ahead because you want to hold on to whatever power that you have. We can even go back. We can even go as simple as government contracts for construction, fixing roads, fixing potholes, right? Why isn't there a seminar in certain neighborhoods on, hey, if you're looking for a job, you can get a government contract to fix your own street?
Yeah.
It's not there because they don't want it to be there.
Yeah. So, Rob, obviously we've lost Al forever. Well, at least for this show.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you're still on with us. And so your work around voting and making sure that communities of color in particular are understand the importance of voting, but also understand the process of how you get there, whether it is at the voting booth or whether it is by other means. And you do that work primarily through No Justice, No Peace, and you also do that work with the 2020 Project, and that's more related to candidates. But so Alan and you mentioned the tour that you're doing, but how can if people are really interested in this work and the work that you are doing to engage and educate and empower communities of color in voting, how can people help you with that work in their own communities, whether that's Des Moines or across the state? How can they engage in the work that you're doing?
Well, I know they always say Rob is always talking about money. And it's the truth. I am always talking about money because that's what's needed in order for anything to happen. In order for us to even pay for the gas to get to certain neighborhoods or the hotel rooms for us to stay in certain areas, it's going to take money to do that. And so you can go to robjjohnson.com and help us get going on some opportunities that we're going to be taking to go do some voting. Al and I on Sundays have been doing church visits. So we've taken time out to go, and we're going all around the state doing church visits. And the reason we do those is because we want our churches to be educated on what the process of voting looks like now, and what safer place to go than to go to a house of worship and say, hey, here's what we're looking for. We're not telling people who to vote for or anything like that. We're simply trying to educate people on the process of voting, because sometimes what I've seen, Connie, is we're asking presidential candidates stuff that we should be asking school board and mayoral candidates. We're asking city council candidates stuff that we should be asking Polk County supervisors and Johnson County supervisors, right? Yeah. And so educating people on what's there and the process of voting is so much more valuable for us. Through No Justice, No Peace, obviously we're focused heavily on African American communities, and then through 2020 Project, we're focused on helping make sure that our people of color are elected to office, and that we're there helping those candidates and making sure that those candidates have the opportunity to have their voices heard. And so they can go there. They can also go to the 2020visionproject.com website as well and find out more about some of the stuff that we're doing. And I'm excited. So please donate, but then also decide if you see that we're setting up in a certain area, whether it's Cedar Rapids, Davenport, Iowa City, Sioux City, wherever, volunteer with us. Volunteer, come out, sit at the booth to help get folks registered. And then also sign up to volunteer when we're not there, so that you can then start running those types of programs in your areas, and then get other friends to volunteer too. Do the church visits that we're doing. We can give you a list of churches that you can go pop in, take some voter registration forms, and make sure that, because obviously they purged the list, so make sure that folks are registered to vote. If they've moved or if anything has changed, make sure that that we are there. But then lastly, it's also about just showing up, having your presence. And for those who can't do it physically, do it in a way by sharing something on Facebook or being active somewhere on social media, or by calling your local elected officials and voicing concerns of people that are around you and that may or may not look like you.
Thank you so much, Rob Johnson. I appreciate your knowledge and sharing your experience and sharing your passion really with everyone. And thanks for Al Womble, who was with us earlier. And I'm so sorry that you weren't able to stay on with us the whole time, but we appreciate you as well and everything that you are doing across the state. For those of you who are watching, thank you for being on What's Happening and for being part of this conversation. I hope that you learned something and that you share in the passion that Rob and Al feel for making sure that all people are able to vote and have access to vote, but also particularly making sure that we are providing access to communities of color and other marginalized communities to make sure that that reach for the ability to vote reaches them in our state. And I am grateful also. I rarely say this, and I should. Kristen Clark is behind the scenes helping with us. She's on our staff, and thank you for Kristen for always being part of this behind the scenes conversation. And for now, I would just say, make sure that you register to vote. This is something that I say at the end of every show. Make sure that you register to vote. If you are not registered to vote, or if you are registered to vote, then help somebody else to register to vote. And one way that you can help is to be involved with No Justice, No Peace and the work that Rob Johnson and Al Womble are doing through that organization. And so thank you, Rob. Thank you for being with us. And for now, everyone, please stay safe in this time of COVID. Take care and have a great week. Thank you.